I'm John Jacob, McAvoy Family Curator for Photography at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's first Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture. The series was established in 2004 to present new insights in American art and is made possible by the ongoing generosity of Clarice Smith. Thank you, Clarice Smith. When I was told that my first official duty at the museum would be to introduce Trevor Paglen, I was both excited and also a little anxious. Excited, on the one hand, to introduce a photographer who's equally at home in the artist's studio and the researcher's laboratory. But nervous, on the other hand, to describe a man whose subjects, including, in addition to photography, include experimental geography, the term he coined for cultural production in the age of Google Earth, as well as state secrecy, military symbology, and human visuality. Paglen's practice blurs the lines separating art from other disciplines, challenging us to see newly, while at the same time reminding us that all vision is fraught, especially vision augmented by artistic and technological means. Paglen's recent project for Creative Time, entitled Last Pictures, embodies his multivalent practice, a collection of 100 historical images stored on permanent media and launched into space. The disk is expected to orbit Earth for billions of years, perhaps as a repository for future civilizations, human or otherwise, but certainly as cosmic debris. Here, Paglen uses the familiar of photographic time to enlarge our understanding, first of human time and endeavor, and then of cosmic time and the ephemerality of recorded history in the face of its enormous difference. Similarly, in his 2010 book, Invisible: Covert Operations and Classified Landscapes, Paglen's photographs are themselves objects of wonder. Their blurs and shimmers prompt us to ask, is this real? What causal relationship can possibly exist between an unnameable place and its visual representation, or between a list of coded names and the ghost entities they're purported to signify? Where do Paglen's images and his lists come from? If they're real, are we complicit in an illegal activity just by looking at them? If they're not, why are they nevertheless so alarming? And what are we to do with the knowledge that Paglen conveys to us through them? Tonight, Trevor Paglen will share research, stories, and images documenting the top-secret infrastructures that he describes as emblematic of our historical moment. From tapped fiber optic cables at the bottom of the ocean, to football field-sized antennas in deep space, the architecture of state surveillance is, paradoxically, as ubiquitous as it is invisible. Paglen's work has expanded the optical technologies of photography so that we might perceive the ubiquitous invisible in our midst and thus confront it. Please join me in welcoming Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecturer, Trevor Paglen.
Hi, guys. Thank you all so much for coming here. It's a wonderful honor to be here. This is an amazing museum and an incredible staff. And I'm developing sort of a real relationship to this museum. There's a few people whose help in putting this lecture together was just absolutely invaluable. I really want to thank Nona Martin's work on this, also Joanna Marsh, and thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, John. Yeah, so here's a beach. When I put together an exhibition, it typically might look something like this. This is an exhibition that I did earlier this year in San Francisco. And if you go to one of my exhibitions, there's some things on walls, there's some images. And hopefully there's some interesting things to look at, but often it can be a little bit cryptic. And behind each of the images and each of the artworks that I make, there's a tremendous amount of, research that goes into it. I'm not an artist who goes into the studio every day and has some genius idea and do some kind of magical thing, and at the end of the day I have a masterpiece. It's pretty much the exact opposite of that, where I'll get an idea and then I'll spend years finding people who are much smarter than me that tell me how to think about it in clearer ways and how to research it. And I spend an enormous amount of time engaging with the world, going out to places, traveling to to see different things, talking to a huge array of people from different disciplines in order to research the artworks that I put together. So it's an intensely empirical practice in that way, and I think about the images that I make as emerging from that from those engagements with the world. Now, I've done a lot of different things over the years, from building these kind of dead image satellites that go around the Earth forever to all sorts of things. But the thing that I really want to talk to you about today is a sort of a body of work that's been developing over many, many years. And it kind of has to do with these themes here: invisible war, mass surveillance, and bad metaphors. And what I mean by these things is that by this idea of invisible war, over the last 15 years or so, we've seen the construction and massive expansion of a war that is largely invisible. This is sometimes called the War on Terror, and people call it the Long War. My friend Derek Gregory, the geographer, calls this the Everywhere War. And this is a war that's fought with things like renditions. It's fought with things like torture, special forces raids, drone assassinations, the weaponization of outer space, the militarization of the internet, mass surveillance, and so on and so forth. And if the Vietnam War is kind of famously understood as the first televised war, then perhaps this Everywhere War is the first war that has not been televised. And the reason for that is that legally and politically, much of this war is classified top secret. And that secrecy translates into a kind of dearth of images and metaphors with which to see this war actually taking place. And so a big part of my job, as I understand it, is to create new metaphors, to try to create ways of seeing. And this really speaks to what I want out of art. Art is an enormously expansive field. It can be many, many things. It can be a formal explorations, people who are looking at beauty and so on and so forth. So it's a huge, huge tent. And I think any artist has to define what their interests are within that enormous range of activities and forms of image making that kind of add up to art. And what I want out of art, and the things that excite me, are things that help us see the historical moment that we live in. And I mean that very literally. Like, what I want out of art is things that help us see this moment in history. And in a way, there's some overlap there with that project between art and social science, journalism, any other kinds of practices. But I'm particularly interested in the visual aspects of this. And this is something that artists have been doing, obviously, for a very, very long time. This is, one of the most famous artworks in the world. This is, of course, Turner's Rain, Steam, Speed from the mid-19th century. And if you take an art history class and this image comes up, this is often described as an early example of abstraction, in painting, kind of a tradition that will culminate in later painters like Rothko and that sort of thing. But I also think about this image in a different way. I actually don't think that this is an abstract painting. I think this is a photorealistic painting of a world that is dramatically speeding up, a world that at the advent of trains and telegrams and global communication systems, a photorealistic of a world that is speeding up faster than human perceptions. And that's really something I think about a lot, is these kinds of images and the history of art when I'm making images. I think that when we make art, or whether we collect art or curate art, we're having a conversation with our compatriots here in this historical moment. We're speaking to each other now, but we're also having a conversation with our ancestors, and we're having a conversation with our descendants as well. And so that's another kind of axis that I situate my own work on. Now, if we fast forward from the kind of technological revolutions of the mid-19th century in a figure like Turner, we fast forward to the last couple of years. Snowden's not Turner, but this guy shows up in 2013. And from Jim Clapper to Keith Alexander to people like Laura Poitras and eventually to me, he really, really, really destroyed a huge number of people's calendars. I mean, he really screwed up a lot of people's schedules and their plans. And the documents that he provided to journalists showed a global system of mass surveillance on a scale that was literally unimaginable. And I talked to lots of people in the IT industry and in computer security work and stuff like that, and pretty much to a person, those people who work outside of the military and outside of the intelligence agencies, to pretty much down to the last person, none of these people could have imagined the scale of the kinds of programs that some of the Snowden documents described. And I had been friends with Laura Poitras, the filmmaker that was one of the people that Snowden had gone to. And we had been talking actually for years already at that point about how to try to see what mass surveillance looks like, how to see what this new reality looked like. In other words, what does this historical moment look like? And I was brought on to work on the film partly as a researcher of this question, try to understand these systems in order to try to learn how to make images of them, and on the other hand, to actually go out and make some images for the film as well. And so this was a kind of a moment where, in order to understand mass surveillance, I had to start looking at the internet, right, and try to understand what does the internet look like? I mean, sounds like the internet is something that we all use all the time, all day, and it's a very intimate part of our lives. In fact, it's probably in many cases maybe one of the most intimate part of our lives. But at the same time, it's something that feels very nebulous and very, immaterial in many ways. If you do a Google search for what is the internet and you do the image button, you get images like this. That's the internet. These ones and zeros, light hole things. You get these like weird fireflies in space that are sparkling around the world. There's a classic one, the cloud. I mean, this is literally a mystifying metaphor, right? So these are the kinds of images that we have. There's other ones that are a little bit better that talk about what the internet is. That's about right. That's a pretty good metaphor, says this one. But what the Snowden documents described was basically not how do we see the internet when we're looking at cats and transformers and star destroyers and things like that. But when the NSA and the military looks at the internet, they see something pretty different. Right? They see infrastructure. And a lot of documents describing things like this. The NSA does not see mystical clouds and kittens and things like that and weird glowing fireflies around the Earth. To the NSA and to the military, the internet is an exceptionally and exquisitely material thing. And when the NSA looks at the internet, it sees cables and routers and switches. Inside those cables are beams of light that are pulsating at different frequencies, wavelengths, bit rates. Images like this describe choke points, data centers, exploits, sensors, ground stations, switches, hardware networks, and much, much more. And these kinds of images were very, very helpful to me in this project of trying to see the internet, and what's more, try to see these structures of mass surveillance that have been made out of the internet. Here's foreign partnerships and corporate partnerships, domestic architectures within the United States where these international choke points happen, other kinds of architectures also within the United States. If I was the NSA, I would not let people use LinkedIn. Pro tip, it's pretty bizarre what you can find on LinkedIn these days. But the point of this is that the mass surveillance of the internet and the weaponization of the internet has an infrastructure and has a geography. And if we look at a slide like this, it's basically all here. On a slide like this, we have things like, we have these cables connecting the continents to one another. We have ground stations. We have access points, these green dots. We have implants, the blue dots. We have a spy satellite here in the sky that's communicating with the ground. And then we have these strange code names: turmoil, tutelage, turbulence, turbine. And so what I want to go through is, for the rest of the talk, is go through basically a document like this and pick it apart and go through the different pieces and see what it looks like and see if we can develop a more robust set of metaphors with which to see the internet and, by extension, the historical moment that we live in. And I want to start by looking at cables. Now, a map like this, again, we see a map of global cables. These are cables that are underwater cables that connect the continents to one another. And you see that although all the continents are connected to each other via these cables, they are not evenly distributed. They have specific routes that they go on. And when the cables come in from the water and fall on land, they fall on land at very specific places, and they're not evenly distributed. So we have landing sites in the Northeast, and in Florida, several different landing sites on the West Coast, Hawaii, Guam, Singapore, Marseille in France, Cornwall in the UK, and so on and so forth. And so if we have a map like this in the back of our head and we go out and look at different landscapes, those landscapes begin to reveal themselves in ways that would otherwise, in many ways, be invisible to us. So, for example, this is a site in Cornwall in the UK. And if we have our cable map in the back of our head, we know that in the foreground here, this beach is one of the world's major cable landing sites. This is one of the sites in the world where many, many different fiber optic cables come across the Atlantic Ocean and make land on these cliffs and go kind of under the ground here. Oh, and guess what's on the cliffs above this landing site? Well, it's a giant NSA base in Cornwall. And that's the kind of thing that I mean. You start to things in the landscape become immediately obvious to you when you have, trained yourself how to see them, as it were. This is the kind of crap that you eat when you hang around in Cornwall. This is another example of a document that describes that. This is a document that was released by Süddeutsche Zeitung. It says where we are, and it's a list of all the underwater fiber optic cables that the NSA or their collaborators, the GCHQ, have taps on, and then it has a code name for the corporate basically corporate partner that they use to tap that cable. For example, here, Remedy is probably BT, and Gerontic is Vodafone. Now, this is I want to give a shout out to another artist, an artist named Ingrid Burrington, who did a really great little project where she took this list of all the cables and overlaid them on a map of global telecommunications cables and shows you which ones are tapped and which ones aren't. And when you look at it, it's pretty obvious. Yeah, well, they're all tapped, basically. And I want to give a shout out to a couple other people as well. The journalist Henrik Molke has done a lot of work on this, as well as Andrew Blum. And again, we see domestic versions of that. Again, these were documents that were released by the New York Times and ProPublica a couple of weeks ago. Again, showing these landing sites with, and these are all sites that NSA has a presence. So what I started doing basically was just going to these landing sites and photographing the beaches and photographing the oceans where these cables come on shore. And the kind of rules of these photographs are that within the frame, the cables, these tapped cables, this choke point has to be within the frame of the image, but of course it's invisible at the same time because the cables might be underwater or under the beach, as it were. And so I started pairing these with kind of collages that I was making. And the collages are made out of images, other images that I shot while visiting these sites, in some cases historical documents, documents referencing some of the other corporate and political relationships that interests in these cables, documents that have come out from the Snowden archive. All of these documents and images speak to a site that, that has basically almost no visual evidence of what's going on with it if you make an image of it. And so kind of putting those two things into tension is kind of the artistic strategy in these works. This is another one of these choke points. This is Point Arena in Northern California. This is just north of San Francisco. And what in the background here of these images are nautical charts, and these are actually nautical charts that show where a lot of these cables actually are on the ocean floor. This is a site in Norden in Germany on the North Sea. And so I was working on this for a number of years, and then I thought, okay, well, making these images that are showing the places where these choke points are, but at the same time this infrastructure is actually not visible in the photograph, and I liked that as a kind of tension or a kind of dialectic within the images. But I also started to think about, well, what would happen if you learned how to scuba dive and then you dove into those photographs? You know, would you start to, what would happen? Who knows? So I started going to some of these, I learned how to scuba dive in a pool in Germany, and then, as you do, and started going around to these places. And actually you have to do quite a lot of work to figure out a place where you might be able to see them, because many times they're even buried, even if they're at the bottom of the ocean. And going out and hiring divers, and we would set up these search patterns on the ocean floor where the idea was we would create routes where if you swam along them, you should run across cables at certain points. And it turns out that's true. So these are production photos from one of the shoots that we did. And these are part of an exhibition that is debuting tomorrow, actually, in New York City at Metro Pictures. That's going to be up until the end of October. And that's what these images are. They're these kind of underwater landscape photos. This is a cable called Columbus 3, which is all of these are cables that have taps on them. This is one called Columbus 3 that connects the East Coast to Lisbon and then to the continental Europe from there. This is a cable that's called Maya 1, which is a Caribbean cable that connects the U.S. to Mexico and Central America. This is a cable called Americas 2, and Americas 2 connects the U.S. to Brazil via the Caribbean islands. Bix 1 connects the U.S. to the Bahamas, and so on and so forth. And there's a number of these. There's all kinds of bits of ephemera. I don't have my own submarine, but I thought I'd throw in a picture of this submarine. It's a submarine whose name is the USS Jimmy Carter. And the USS Jimmy Carter is a submarine who's designed in part to be able to land on cables on the bottom of the ocean and install taps on them. So when we come back to this map, we've kind of taken a look at what these things look like. What are these cables? What are these wiretapped cables on the bottom of the oceans and these landing sites and these choke points where they converge? But we see many other kinds of things in this overall architecture. And here, for example, we have a thing there called MHS. That stands for Men with Hill Station. This is a ground station. It's kind of a hub where different kind of activities take place. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at ground stations. Ground stations are places where satellites might need to downlink, cables need to connect to data centers. Passive surveillance of networks requires sensors on those networks and that sort of thing. And we spent a lot of time going to different places like around the country and actually around the world and looking for different kinds of ground stations. Some of them, particularly the satellite downlinks and that sort of thing that can there's a number of these kinds of things that are out in the deserts in the West, like in Nevada and New Mexico and that sort of thing. And many of these places, you really can't get anywhere near them because they'll just have massive, massive buffer zones around them, massive swaths of restricted land. So one of the techniques I started doing was thinking about, okay, well, if I could find a mountaintop that would theoretically have a line of sight to one of these places, even if the place was so far away that you couldn't see it with your eyes, would you be able to develop imaging equipment derived from imaging equipment designed for astronomy and astrophotography and retool that equipment so that you can take very, very long distance pictures from the ground? And so what I started doing was kind of think about what would happen. See, this is like an Ansel Adams photograph, and let's just say Ansel took this with a 50 millimeter lens or something like that. What if instead of using a 50 millimeter lens, you used a 5,000 millimeter lens that was designed to take a picture of Jupiter, and you applied it to an image like this? Would you see something different in the landscape? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, you would. And so this has been a number of images using this technique. This is a classified Air Force base in Nevada. This shot from a distance of about 36 miles. This is actually the NSA's giant data center in Utah, in Bluffdale. This is basically the world's largest hard drive where all emails and medical records and text messages and all the bits of electronic communications that constitute our lives are kind of stored. This is a downlink in New Mexico for reconnaissance satellites. So reconnaissance satellites, when they're flying overhead, they need to downlink the data that they collect somewhere. And they collect in places like this. Incidentally, this is right next to the Trinity site in New Mexico, the site where the first nuclear bomb was set off. In many of these images, the thing that I'm trying to photograph is, even despite the fact that you're using a telescope, it's beyond the range of anything that you can see. So a lot of these images begin to collapse and they begin to fall apart. This is an image from about 44 miles away. Again, this is 40-something miles away. Around 65 miles, you get a kind of complete collapse of vision. And that's kind of one extreme of this, seeing at a distance, in a sense. This is a different way of seeing something similar that you find in different landscapes. For example, this is that installation that was mentioned in the slide before, the MHS, this Men with Hill Station. And it's just in the British countryside. And when we were out photographing this, and I just kept laughing and laughing, and my assistant was like, "Why do you keep laughing?" And I was just like, there is literally a stone church in the foreground of this image, and then we have this giant NSA base that's landed like some kind of alien, like spaceship in the background here. And again, we see references to these kinds of places. And there's a document describing different kinds of cyber warfare attacks. Again, any kind of landscape that you're going to look at, anything in the world that you can ever look at, is something that other artists have been looking at for hundreds of years and have seen through their own eyes. So again, it's always looking, when you're making these kinds of images and looking at these kinds of landscapes, you're not only talking to the other people that are alive now, you're in a way talking to the people who looked at them before you. This was actually commissioned by the City of London to be a giant panorama in a tube station there at Gloucester Road. So we actually made this subway station that was this giant panorama that had Men with Hill in the background. When you start to look again at the architecture of the internet, again, it's not evenly distributed. It's not some mystifying cloud that's like here and there and nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The internet is made out of smaller networks that are joined to other networks, and that's how the internet is like a network of networks. And all of those networks come together at very specific places in the world. In Europe, they come together in London at the London Internet Exchange, in Amsterdam, and in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt's a really, really important one. It connects a lot of terrestrial fiber optic cables and networks in Europe to each other. Now, when you start driving around Frankfurt, it becomes pretty obvious that the NSA has all kinds of little bases all around Frankfurt, and they're sitting on the cables as they're going into the exchanges. This is a place called the Dagger Complex. This is a place that I don't even know if it has a name. It's near a little town called Egelsbach. And these are the kinds of places that, that I was commissioned to shoot for the Citizen 4 film. And these are kind of stills from that. When you're shooting these kind of places and photographing these kinds of installations, the police show up very regularly. Even though it's perfectly legal, what you're doing, you can stand on public land and take a picture of whatever you want. This is a pretty fundamental right, not only in the US, but in many countries. In Germany, it's called the right to panorama. Yeah, it's a real thing. Even in, but you know, you still often have long and involved conversations with German police, American military police, blah, 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 about the, you know, so you know, this is how you earn your money, basically, you know, sitting through these things. And basically, when I was actually photographing in Germany, this was happening so often, like every single day, I was sitting there, you know, talking to military police and German police for, you know, 4 or 5 hours. Usually, I'm the one translating because I speak German. German cops don't speak English, and American MPs don't speak German, so I'm the suspect, but I'm like telling these cops what the... Anyway, I got kind of sick of this. And I thought, okay, you guys, this is perfectly legal, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a photo contest. And I got the Frankfurt Kunstverein, which is a museum in Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt Journal, which is a magazine in Frankfurt, to sponsor this contest where, okay, who can take the best picture of an NSA site in Germany? And here's a list of all of them that we know about. So it was, you know, so this was a kind of exercise of the rights to do that. And the winner, you know, you get your picture in an exhibition, you get your picture in the newspaper and stuff like that. It was great. We had about 120 people submitted photographs. They were very, very high quality. And we chose 5 winners, and we had a kind of award ceremony in Frankfurt and stuff. It was fun. But when we come back to this diagram here, we're looking at these cables, we're looking at ground stations. One of the things that interests me a lot as an artist is this kind of thing, these code names: turmoil, tutelage, turbine, turbulence, these bits of nonsense that are attached to these programs. These are names that are designed to be deliberately disorienting, to be deliberately nonsensical. They're names that are designed in such a way as that if you see them and you're not read into them, that you can't derive any information whatsoever about them. And that kind of epistemological conundrum or what have you feels like is very interesting to me as kind of an aesthetic question. And so I've done a number of projects where I would just go through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents and pulling out code names of different NSA programs. So for example, this one's called Shell Trumpet processes its 1 trillionth metadata record. So it's talking about something called Shell Trumpet. There's another thing mentioned here: Dancing Oasis, Musketeer, Oakstar, Mystic, Traffic Thief. And so I was just spent a long time compiling this giant list of thousands and thousands and thousands of these code names. I'm up to something like, I was actually up to something like 15,000, but then I had too many, and so I edited it down. And there's been a number of things that I've done with this. So there's one use of this archive, really, that's just a room that you go and stand in, and it's just these code names scrolling all around you, and it almost feels like you're falling when you stand among them because they're all going up into the sky. We did something really fun in London when Citizen 4 debuted in London last year. We decided to project these lists onto kind of famous buildings all over the city for a week, including Parliament. So for a week in October last year, if you went and you looked at Parliament at nighttime, there would just be these giant lists of code names scrolling on the building's facade. Now, I have a long interest in these things, these spacecraft and satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, things that they're called overhead assets. And so I spent a lot of time watching the skies. And tracking satellites and photographing them is pretty tricky because they move around, and they're very, very faint when you can see them at all. And on top of that, the orbits that a military or intelligence satellite will be in is secret, and the existence of these satellites is often secret. But so the NSA or NRO or military, they can have all the secret satellites that they want, but what they can't have is their own secret laws of physics. And the good news about satellites is that they all have to follow Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And so what you can do, quite literally, is if you get a couple of little observations of a satellite, you can literally use 17th century mathematics to learn some of the deepest, darkest secrets about the locations of highly, highly classified bits of hardware. The caveat is I'm actually even terrible at 17th century mathematics, so you can use computers, thank God. And what you do is and there's a group of amateur astronomers around the world, about a dozen people who do this as a hobby. What they go out and they look in the sky and they take notes of uncatalogued things that they see in the sky. In other words, things that they see in the sky that are not found in UN catalogs or American military catalogs of spacecraft. And the reason for that is if you see something in the sky that's not cataloged somewhere, you can be, very confidently sure that what the reason for that is that it's an American spy satellite, because there's publications that publish the orbital elements of Chinese spy satellites and Russian ones. So that data looks like this, and you can use a document like this. You can crunch those numbers, throw them into a piece of software that will model the orbit, and once you've modeled the orbit, you can make a prediction about where something will be in the sky, and you can use equipment basically that looks like this that will help you track them. Now, me coming from a background in art, the idea that you could do some math and say something is going to happen in the sky, and then you do it all, and then that thing actually happens, this like blew my mind when I started doing this project. I just couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. But yeah, you can do that. And so I've been using that technique to make images actually for many, many years. This, for example, is a photograph that you'll see this line here that's interrupting the image. What that line is something called a keyhole satellite, and it's basically like it's almost like an evil twin of the Hubble Space Telescope, but it's like pointed down at Earth. And there's a whole lot of secret Hubble telescopes that are pointed down at Earth, and this is one of them. One of the things, again, I love these patches, little bits of ephemera, little bits of culture that get produced around these programs. And a number of years ago, this outfit here, this outfit called the Rapid Capabilities Office, they funded something called the X-37B, and this is a photograph that the Air Force released of it. This is the thing in the background. And what it is basically like a secret Air Force space shuttle drone, right? So it's basically like the space shuttle, but it goes up on the top of a rocket. It lands like an airplane, but it's unmanned, so it's entirely remote controlled. And this is a photograph of it in the sky. I think it's on its third or fourth mission right now. I'm not really sure. I remember. But anyway, it's called the X-37B, and I was really delighted when I came across this patch for the guys who control it from the ground. They had to use the X-Files X and these weird cat eyes or what have you. The Rapid Capabilities Office, again, I started looking at this patch a little bit closer, and in the background they have this black world, but then this is actually pretty cute here. Their little saying is Opus Dei, doing God's work with other people's money. This is a golden oldie at this point, but this is a pretty typical of a patch, like the National Reconnaissance Office. That's like it's a space agency like NASA, but does largely secret stuff. And they were in charge of all the spy satellites and things like that. Then they had this patch. This was for an older spacecraft that launched in 2000. We Own the Night. That actually, in these eyes, it actually refers to a technique for making images called synthetic aperture radar, where they use radar waves to bounce it off the Earth's surface and create an image. And in doing so, it allows them to see through clouds, see at night, do things that a normal kind of optical imaging system isn't really able to do. The funny thing about this patch is satellites always work in teams, and like a team of satellites is called a constellation. The orbital inclinations depicted on the patch for this constellation of satellites was accurate. So you could look at this patch and be like, oh, well, I guess that's where these secret satellites are, which was true. You know? So this is a photograph of that. They launched a satellite about 4 or 5 months after Snowden's revelations, when everybody's very, very upset about mass surveillance and really questioning it. So they, of course, launched this satellite, which is a little bit tone deaf, guys. You know, you're like, maybe that wasn't the time to be launching patches of like giant fascist octopuses, you know, like taking over the world, you know. So I've been making collections of these things. You know, I have a lot of fun with this stuff. This is a picture, again, you know, thinking about the histories of other people who've shot the kind of things that you've shot or looked at the kind of landscapes that you've looked at. I think about a lot about 19th century Western photography. I'm from California, and that's a big part of the background and a big part of, you know, kind of where I cut my teeth as an artist. And the histories of art there are very much tied to the frontier and tied to, you know, photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan and Muybridge. Were oftentimes funded by people like the Department of War as a part of survey photographs. And so a lot of the photography that we see of the West from the mid and late 19th century, we see it now as art, landscape photography, and it is, but it also was a kind of 19th century version of what reconnaissance satellites do today. And one descendant of that tradition of survey photography is, of course, a spy satellite taking pictures in the sky. Another descendant of that tradition would be somebody like me taking a picture of a landscape with a spy satellite in the sky. But then there's a little bit of a twist, which is, of course, that other tradition of photography is also taking a picture of me, taking a picture of it, taking a picture of the landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So you know, you get into some little art history triple gainers with this stuff sometimes. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about wanting out of art things that help us see the historical moment that we live in, things that help us see the underlying forces that are sometimes structuring the world, and that are specific to the historical moment that we live in. But there's a little bit of another thing that I want out of art as well, which is that I want art to also help us see how the world could be different, how reality could be different if some things were changed around, if assumptions were questioned and that sort of thing. So one of the questions that I've asked myself is, what would the opposite of an infrastructure like this look like? What would an alternative, you know, landscape of communication and surveillance look like? And this is so one of the projects that kind of has to do with this question is a collaboration with this guy. This is a guy named Jake Applebaum, who's a pretty well-known hacker and computer security researcher and a digital civil libertarian. And the question that we were talking about was, what would the internet look like if it wasn't the greatest instrument of state surveillance and control in the history of mankind? What would an alternative internet look like? Could we think about what an internet with different values built into technology be like? And this is a project that we've been working on. We call it Autonomy Cube. And what Autonomy Cube does, it's a sculpture that when you install it in a museum, you basically hook it into the museum's internet connection. So there's a cable, a power cable comes into it, and an Ethernet cable comes into it, and that Ethernet is obviously attached to the host institution's infrastructure. And what it does is, the first thing that it does is it creates an open Wi-Fi network that anybody can use for free. But then it takes all of that all of that traffic and it encrypts it. And then what it does is it puts that traffic onto something called the Tor network. And the Tor network is a way of using the internet anonymously. Tor was originally developed by the Navy because the Navy had a problem, and actually the intelligence agencies had a problem. They had people doing open source intelligence gathering on the internet, And the problem was that if you were at the CIA or something like that and you wanted to read, Persian language newspapers or something like that, that the websites that you were looking at could trace your IP and see that, oh, there's the 80 people from the CIA read, the newspaper in Tehran today or whatever. And they wanted to prevent that from happening. And so they created this network called Tor, which encrypts your data. And then what it does is that it bounces your traffic to a series of volunteer-run relays across the world. So all over the world, there's about 2,000 people who have installed these Tor relays in their homes, places of business, universities, and that sort of thing. And you will allocate, and they'll allocate a certain amount of bandwidth from their home connection or whatever to this Tor, to be this Tor relay, to allow people from around the world to anonymize their traffic by connecting through it. Now, so when you connect to it, for example, Tor might bounce your traffic to a relay in Germany, and then to a relay in, Japan, then to a relay in, France, and then when you're reading the Tehran Times or whatever it is, the Tehran Times sees, oh, an anonymous user in Paris is reading it, right? So you've anonymized the content, so anybody that intercepts your content along the way can't read it because it's encrypted, and it anonymizes your location from the eventual place that you're looking at. And so we were thinking about Tor as being a kind of alternative vision of what the internet could be. And actually, although it was initially funded by the intelligence community and the Navy, the State Department actually began help funding Tor as well. The reason for that was that they wanted dissidents in Iran to be able to communicate with the outside world without their traffic being intercepted by the regime in Iran and then showing up at people's houses and kidnapping them, torturing them, throwing them in prison, and that sort of thing. And so this is a kind of the group of people that is working on building these autonomy cubes. It was installed, one of the first big installations where it was at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, which is the same museum where the Guernica, Picasso's Guernica was installed. So we were very happy to be able to install it here. When you install this thing, you have to work with the IT department of the museum. You really have to work with the whole institution to install this thing and get it going. And one of the things that kind of animates the project is thinking about what digital freedom is. What is online freedom? And we're thinking a lot about the role of civic institutions in societies, thinking about institutions like museums, thinking about institutions like libraries. We're thinking about what's really important for libraries and why libraries are so important to democracy, is that a library is a place where you can go and you can explore ideas that might challenge the status quo, that might challenge yourself. You can explore your own self by encountering a huge range of ideas and checking out books, and you can explore the society by encountering a huge range of ideas about how societies have worked in the past, how they might work in the future, and that sort of thing. So libraries are absolutely crucial parts of any kind of civic, kind of democratic infrastructure, because they allow you to explore ideas. And secondly, and this is just as important, is the fact that the police don't get an email of all of the books that you're checking out. It's crucially important, and that freedom also has to come with the absence of surveillance. That's a precondition for that kind of freedom. So we're thinking a lot about what would the internet look like if it was built with those kinds of values in mind. And also installing these in a museum is a little bit of a provocation as well. Museums at this moment are more and more thinking about installing like biometric sensor networks so that they can go and keep track of the kind of visitors that are coming, where people are going, what artworks they're looking at, how long they're spending in front of those kinds of artworks. And it makes sense, like that institutions want to have really robust demographic data sets and that sort of thing. But the provocation we're also making here is like, well, maybe museums and maybe libraries can be some of the only places in the society where that doesn't happen, because that's happening everywhere. And maybe we should think about developing spaces where that are kind of oases from that kind of surveillance. And so while on one hand we're thinking about these social and political relationships that are built into technological networks, there's always a dialectic at work. And this is one of my favorite Air Force Cyber Command patches, where they have this and then this is the cube from the Borg, the bad guys in Star Trek, and the Air Force Cyber Resistance is futile. Okay, fine. And other examples of these kind of opposite world projects very quickly is I've been thinking about these satellites a lot and thinking about the ways in which space technology has been developed. And I was thinking a lot about could you build a satellite that was not a weapon? Could you build a satellite that had no commercial, scientific, or military function whatsoever? Could you build a satellite just because you wanted to build one, because you thought it would be beautiful? And so we actually have worked with a designer for a number of years coming up with different ideas for just ridiculous satellites, like Fatnik, a lot of different kinds of designs. And we settled on a design that we're actually working on right now, which is based around something called a CubeSat. It's a very, very small satellite that would piggyback into space on somebody else's rocket. And so that would go up on a rocket, and then our little satellite would get pooped out the side. And then what it does is it opens up and expands to become a giant kind of mirrorized ball. And that's all it is, just a giant mirrorized ball that reflects sunlight back down to Earth and kind of creating almost like a little artificial star in the sky. This is one of the models of it that we've developed, some other ones. Again, when you're making these kind of artworks, you're always talking to your ancestors, think of Warhol's clouds or Robert Morris's cubes. So again, there's always a historical axis. You're always looking at something, you're always doing something that another artist in the past has looked at or had a different interpretation of. Visually, a lot of the work that I do tends to be pretty abstract, even though there's a lot of research that goes into it, as I've hoped to kind of show you a little bit. But I tend to find myself always attracted to these kinds of images that are hazy and indistinct, and partly because I think that the world is hazy and indistinct and difficult to see, and that I don't think images actually have many answers. And so what is that kind of role of questioning? And again, there's many artists who've done exactly this kind of thing as well over the years. So to kind of finish up, I mean, all of this adds up to kinds of ways of seeing that I've been trying to develop, and ways of seeing that I've been trying to use to see the world that we live in now, here in 2015. And so there is a kind of aesthetic exploration here. There is a kind of, infrastructural exploration going in here. But underlying all of this is the fact that I think we're living in a very, very difficult moment in history. We have come into a moment in history where that dystopian future of global mass surveillance of all data, where computers have been turned into weapons that can be wielded in secret, where flying drone army assassination robots are ubiquitous. And all the while, economic inequality is reaching unparalleled levels, and the seas are rising, and the storms are getting stronger and stronger. And we don't have to do this. There's no reason why the future has to be a totalitarian surveillance society with nonstop hurricanes, droughts, and environmental destruction. But we have to work actively against that future. And unfortunately, that other bad future seems like the default one at the current moment. And I'm not sure how to do that. I don't have any answers. But I do hope that trying to learn how to see that present can be a part of that process. Thank you guys all so much for coming tonight.
Can I go?
Hey, Greg.
Hey. Thank you, as always, a very inspiring or depressing in equal measure. I wonder if, especially now that you're here in Washington, if you have a sense of your audience in this world. I know from the earliest days when you were collecting the patches, I know you had a lot of interaction with people who would sort of fact check or give you hints or laugh at your interpretations of what these secret patches meant. Do you have any sense that this is being seen and interpreted or affecting in some way the work that's going on, or do you have a sense of trying to figure out how to influence those parts of your audience that may even be among us, we don't know?
Yeah. There's a number of things that I guess I have to say about that. One is that, I don't look for art to have kind of a means-ends relationship to policy or things like that at all. I mean, I feel like as an artist, you can kind of make images, you can try to make metaphors that help articulate certain things, you can draw attention to certain places and away from others maybe. But artworks don't make linear arguments, right? I mean, it's not a policy paper, it's not even an op-ed. They're deeply strange things that will run away from you the second that you try to pin them down and say what they mean. They say the images are worth 1,000 words. Well, tell that to the number of, thousands and thousands of trees that have had to die for Jackson Pollock dissertations. Many, many more than 1,000 words, right? Because what the hell are these things? Who knows what the stuff this is? But having said that, I interact a lot with people in the intelligence community and have gotten lots of different kinds of feedback and lots of different kinds of relationships, and those are, it's the whole range. I did a book that was, I showed some of these patches that these are silly and doing God's work with other people's money. I wrote a book about that, and that was, on one hand, like a lot of my friends, like in the kind of lefty academic world, were like, this book is great. It's like totally crazy and showing these self-referentiality and self-criticality that's going on among these military programs. It's a glimpse into that kind of culture on one hand, and then on the other hand, it was like a bestseller, like in the Stars and Stripes newspaper and like within the military. And I've had like, intelligence contractors tell me like, oh yeah, we have that book like on our coffee table, like in the lobby, if you go to these like little boutique intelligence corporations and things like that. So it's been a huge range. And that's like one thing that I've found within the people who work on these programs, that there's been kind of two sides of it. On one hand, I think there's some people are a little bit concerned, like, well, you shouldn't be looking at these kind of satellites. They're like really secret, and they're secret for a reason, and that is upsetting to some people. On the other hand, a lot of people I know who work on these kinds of projects, this can be very, very alienating stuff to work on. And I've talked to, I'd talked to a guy who had worked on classified aircraft his whole life, and I said, what's it like to work on these things? Like, what's going on culturally? And he said, well, first of all, if you're in this secret flight test squadron, like the divorce rates in here are just off the charts, like something like 85% divorce if you join this unit or something like that, because you are in a situation where you can't necessarily tell your family what you do for a living, where you go to work, you disappear for long periods of time, and can't really say anything about it. One guy said, working on these projects, it's like you have to look your mother in the eye every day and lie to her. That's what it's like. And so in a way, I think with a lot of these kinds of images, paradoxically, it is a recognition of people's work in a way. And so I think that that's another response that I've gotten, is that people say, Trevor, I really like your work because it's an acknowledgement of the thing that I spent my life doing actually exists, right? And that actually somebody else can see it, in a weird way. So it's a very complicated set of relationships, I think.
Thank you so much for your talk and your work. It's really awesome. My question is similar, but sort of on the other end. Like, have you felt at any time that I'm very interested in misinformation and how the intelligence systems and the military have agents that sort of intentionally throw people off, so you hide their scent. Have you ever felt that someone like that engaged you? And did you ever suspect that? And like, it sounds like you have a good relationship with a lot of people because you relate to their humanity, but have you ever felt that there was someone really working to disrupt your work and intimidated beyond just having a conversation with the police, but really like fearing for your safety or the safety of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I do that is that kind of, I hope, inoculates me from that kind of, so I think I have had conversations over the years where I look back and like, what was that? That was really weird. Why did that conversation happen? But one thing that I really insist on is like the materiality and thinking about when something happens in the world, what are all the kind of tertiary records that get created around that? I'm going to use an example just that a friend of mine who's an investigative journalist uses a lot. This guy, A.C. Thompson, that I've worked a lot with over the years. One of the things that he says is like, okay, well, if you want to look at something over there, look at where the evidence would be over here. So for example, there's a big conspiracy that's like the chemtrails conspiracy. And this conspiracy says that there's some kind of mind control chemicals are being put into airplanes. And when you see them flying overhead, the white trail that comes out of the airplanes is like mind control chemicals that are being dumped on all of us so that we're sheep and slaves to the capitalist, whatever it is. And I think about, okay, cool. So let's think about like that. Let's assume that's a real program. So what that means is that at airports, there has to be a company that makes these chemicals. Who is that? DuPont? Where's the contract? Can you FOIA it? You can sort of get a sense of what kind of companies have military contracts and what they would, and what that contract would consist of, how much money it was. But also it says like, okay, well, that means that at airports you have to have crews of people that can work with hazardous chemicals and install them on these airplanes. It also means that the airplanes have to be engineered so that they have compartments on them to carry these chemicals. It also means that if you're working with mind-altering chemicals at airports, that there's going to be chemical spills from time to time, and that a hazmat team from a local fire department is going to have to come in and clean it up. You can get hazmat records from a fire department and say like, okay, where's all the hazmat responses that like the fire department around McCarran Airport had? Oh, there's none for mind-altering chemicals at Las Vegas Airport in the last billion years or whatever. So that's the kind of thing that I mean. And I think when you kind of take that approach to the research and you kind of look for those traces of evidence, you inoculate yourself a lot from this kind of disinformation or mythology that might be out there. Having said that, I mean, there was a document I came across a number of years ago that was about how to create classified cover stories. So it was like, how do you create a cover story that it itself is classified so that if a journalist, they find something classified and they say like, oh, it must be true, it's classified, but then there's actually a classified cover story that is then covering something else up. And when you start thinking about that, you really get into this, epistemological hall of mirrors.
First of all, thank you. This was a wonderful talk and really interesting work. And I had a question about that, your kind of theme of sort of aesthetics and the aesthetic exploration. And it came from that turbulence map document you kept returning to. And I was struck by how kind of hokey it looks.
Yeah.
It would not be especially accurate. I'm sure there's a lot of things missing on it.
Sure.
And comparing that to the kind of stunning beauty of a lot of the images that you are making in relation to this. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, surveillance aesthetics compared to your own aesthetic in approaching that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that was the other part of this. Like when you look at, internal NSA documents that have been released by journalists and that sort of thing, you get the sense of like, oh, mass surveillance looks like bad PowerPoint, I mean, and it does, in that sense. But that it can be very revealing, I guess, in a way. But I am interested in aesthetics, and I am interested in, and the world's a complicated place, and aesthetics don't always do what you want them to do. In other words, I haven't made an argument about whether spy satellites are good or bad, but you could say, okay, they're bad for XYZ reasons, fine. then you could say, well, if they're bad, then why do your photographs of them look beautiful? And my answer is, actually, if you go out with me and I show you a spy satellite in the constellation Orion, it's a stunningly beautiful thing to behold. A shimmering light that is moving slowly through a constellation in the sky. What could be more breathtakingly beautiful than that? And the point that I'm making is that I think a lot of us are secret Platonists in the sense that we want bad things to look bad and we want good things to look good. And that's not the way the world works, and that's not the way the aesthetics work. And so that's something that I actually play with a lot in the work, is kind of playing with those kinds of expectations about the relationship between aesthetics and ethics and something's goodness or badness or what have you. And I am using aesthetic strategies that other artists, again, throughout time have used. But what's also very important to me is, in a way, it's to kind of give you permission to look at things. And I think that's a big thing that art can do. It can give you permission to look at things that you might not otherwise look at. And that there's an institutional part to that, like putting something in institution. But then I think there's also an aesthetic dimension to that as well. And for me, the fact that something bad can be beautiful is much more unsettling than the idea that something that is bad could look good, or look that would look bad, for example.
Thank you. That was a great talk. But I wanted to ask you about your alternative world, which gave me a lot of problems.
Yeah.
As is well known, Tor and the black internet is largely used for pornography and sexual abuse.
Some of it is.
Yeah, well, some of it is quite a lot used in that kind of way. At least that's what we're told.
That's what you're told, yeah.
Yeah. And I wondered if there were more radical ways to think of an alternative, so that one might try and think not in terms of autonomy, but in terms of some kind of relationality, which didn't involve surveillance from a top-down position.
Yeah, what do you mean by that relationality, I guess? I mean, the way that Tor works is that it is relational and it's created. Let's talk about the child pornography first, and then we'll move on to the second part, which I really want to hear more about. Yes, you can use Tor to do bad things. You can use the internet to do bad things. There was child pornography before there was the internet, and there was child pornography on the internet before there was Tor. There was child pornography in the early days of AOL. AOL let it go. And that in the US, there's a lot of up in arms, and the FBI and the DEA being very upset about Tor because people do bad things on Tor. It's not primarily used by people who are doing bad things, but it can be used by people doing bad things. In the same way people use cars for bad things and highways for bad things as well. But my provocation to that is, yes, there are people's lives who can be in part, whose harm can come to people through this technology. But we can also think about the thousands and thousands of lives that Tor has saved. Think about if you're young and you're queer and in Uganda and you want to connect with other people who have this experience around the world. If you're using an open internet connection, you are in grave danger because local police can be surveilling that connection. The state can be surveilling that connection. You explore your sexuality online, police can show up and torture you and disappear you. And this is what can happen actually most places in the world. It's actually, we have a little bit of a place of privilege here in the US in that despite the existence of the NSA and X, Y, and Z, we live in a tremendously free society, and that just simply is not true for most of the world. And tools like Tor were, primarily designed in the first instance to enable people to have those kinds of liberties in places where cops really do look at what you're looking at on the internet and show up, and very bad things happen. So I just want to put that into tension with the fact that people also do use Tor for bad things. I want to talk about what you mean by this question of a relational internet, though, as well, because this is something that's very interesting to me.
Well, I'm not it's not my field, and
Yeah.
therefore I can't imagine it
Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah.
But, in certain kinds of, I'm a philosopher rather than
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
And in certain kinds of philosophy,
Yeah.
what one's looking for is something that's not top-down
Yeah.
and is also not privileging an autonomy
Yeah,
that
sure.
is individualized,
Right.
but has a way of the network policing itself in certain kinds of
Yeah.
way, though police is not a good word.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
controlling and limiting itself.
Yeah.
And I would have thought in terms of imagining an ideal that's an alternative,
Yeah.
that's what I would be trying to
Yeah.
imagine,
Yeah.
rather than trying to imagine another kind of what sounds like libertarian autonomy.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, well, Tor, first of all, in the first instance, is a volunteer network. So the actual infrastructure of it is volunteer run around the world. And the software is open software. Anybody can look at it. Anybody can use it. Anybody can contribute to it. And so in that sense, it is a very distributed system. There's not a hierarchy, a top-down hierarchy built into it. But I'm not going to answer the second part of your question because I don't know. I don't know. But I do think it's like a really, really important thing to think about, and that when we imagine these alternative kinds of internets, the fact that maybe a talk like this or a piece like the autonomy can provoke that conversation, that maybe in and of itself can be pretty helpful in terms of articulating what an alternative future might be.
Trevor, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
And we'd like the audience to join us in a reception upstairs. Thank you.